The battlefield burned under a fractured sky. Plasma fire painted glowing streaks across the storm-ridden heavens, and explosions tore through the air, leaving behind a cacophony of chaos, screams of the wounded, and the metallic groan of crushed machines. Velos 7, humanity's distant colony world, bore the scars of relentless war. Its once rugged beauty was masked by fire and ash. Captain Daniel Cole huddled behind the remnants of a blasted drone, his rifle slick with dirt and sweat. His heart pounded, but his gaze remained sharp. The war between Earth's forces and the fierce Ziari Empire had raged for years, consuming lives and planets alike. Victory was within reach. He could feel it. But amidst the carnage today, something felt different. Something ominous. A sharp crack split the air, louder than any weapon's fire or explosion he had heard before. The ground beneath Daniel shuddered violently, throwing him off balance. He hit the dirt hard, rolling to avoid a jagged piece of shrapnel that embedded itself where he had just crouched. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself up, shaking off the stunned haze. Around him, soldiers froze, their weapons momentarily forgotten as all eyes turned toward the horizon. A tear in the sky had opened wide, glowing with a fierce, unearthly light. It rippled and writhed like a wound in reality itself, a breach, unnatural and alive. From its depths, an eerie hum began to resonate, low and insistent, vibrating in the marrow of Daniel's bones. Whatever was coming, it wasn't human, nor was it the Ziari. This was something else entirely. "Captain Cole," came the urgent voice of Lieutenant Greaves over the comms. "Do you see that? Sensors are going crazy. Energy signatures off the charts. This isn't anything we've encountered before." Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle as dread sank into his chest. He didn't answer immediately. He was transfixed by the breach, watching as shadowy silhouettes began to stir within its luminescent maw. The storm above seemed to feed it, bolts of lightning crackling and twisting into its center. And then, the first figure emerged, a sleek, towering shape cloaked in an unnatural haze, its movements fluid, yet unnervingly sharp, like a predator stalking its prey. "Greaves," Daniel finally barked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Get me a full tactical scan. We need to know what we're dealing with. Everyone else, hold position and prepare for engagement. Whatever this is, it's not friendly." The battlefield had been a war zone moments ago, but now it was eerily silent, save for the ominous hum of the breach. Every soldier stood poised, their tension mirrored in the charged air. Daniel stared at the emerging figures, an unshakable feeling gnawing at him. This was just the beginning. The war with the Ziari suddenly felt like a distant memory. Something far worse had arrived. Then he saw her. High General Erin Thalvara of the Ziari Empire stood in defiance against the tide of death. Her golden armor was slashed and scorched, the war's brutality etched into every dent. Even wounded, she commanded presence, her deep sapphire skin gleaming under the violent glow of plasma fire. Her twin-star eyes burned with defiance, but her movements faltered, a crimson stain spreading over her side. Daniel's breath caught as their eyes met. Erin's gaze bore into him, not with the malice he might have expected from an enemy commander, but with something deeper, urgency, desperation. She took a shaky step forward, her weapon clattering to the ground, the sound lost amidst the crackling fissure behind her. "Hold your fire!" Daniel snapped instinctively, raising a hand to stay his troops. Confusion flickered across their faces, but they obeyed, their weapons reluctantly lowered though, still at the ready. Erin staggered closer, her form wavering as though the very air protested her presence. She moved as if every step was a battle, her resolve keeping her upright even as blood dripped from her wounds. When she finally spoke, her voice was strained but unbroken, every word weighted with gravity. "They're coming for all of us," she said, each syllable rasping with effort. "Your war with the Ziari, it no longer matters. If we don't stand together now, there will be no one left to fight for." Daniel's heart thundered. The breach seemed to groan behind her, its brilliance intensifying as the shadowy figures multiplied. With every second, the silhouettes became clearer, limbs too long, eyes like voids, their forms bending unnaturally as they advanced. Whatever these things were, they exuded an oppressive wrongness, a sense of complete and utter annihilation. "General, what exactly are they?" Daniel pressed, stepping forward, his rifle still clenched in wary hands. Erin turned briefly towards the breach, her face pale despite her sapphire skin. When her gaze returned to his, it was filled with something Daniel hadn't thought possible: fear. "They are the Nihara, the end of worlds." Daniel froze. The name Erin whispered between human ranks, laced with both fear and awe. She was no mere warrior. She was the architect of Earth's countless defeats, a foe of near-mythic reputation. And yet here she stood, unarmed, vulnerable, but resolute. Earth Marines surged forward, rifles aimed, their orders clear. "Terminate on sight." A chill washed over him. Instinct screamed at Daniel to stay hidden, to finish his mission. And yet, a voice deeper inside him, one he barely recognized anymore through years of destruction, spoke louder. He couldn't watch her die. Not like this. "Get down!" he yelled, his voice cutting through chaos. Erin's starfire gaze snapped toward him, narrowing in disbelief. Before she could react, Daniel darted forward, shoving her behind cover. Plasma bolts scorched the dirt where she'd been moments before. The Marines halted in confusion, unsure of their captain's sudden betrayal. "What are you doing?" Erin hissed in her native tongue, clutching her wounded side. "Stopping them from killing you," Daniel replied without hesitation. He kept his weapon half lowered, his stance balanced precariously between ally and enemy. "We can talk, negotiate. You didn't hesitate to surrender. I saw it in your stance. Are you so proud you'd rather die?" "Mercy from humans?" Erin spat, though her voice betrayed exhaustion. "What's your game, Captain?" "No game. Just humanity," Daniel said through gritted teeth. "Call it desperation if that makes you feel better." Her piercing glare softened for just a moment, long enough to weigh the man who stood before her. Slowly, painfully, she nodded. Behind them, Earth Marines watched with suspicion, their weapons still raised, and yet they hesitated. Above them, the storm crackled with fury, the silence between enemies almost deafening. Erin's survival wasn't in their orders. Captain Cole's actions weren't either. For a fleeting moment, the chaos ebbed, leaving only fragile, uncertain stillness. The spell of silence shattered as an explosion tore through the air, shaking the ground and sending a wave of heat across the battlefield. Erin flinched, her sharp eyes darting to the source, a cluster of burning machinery where one of her ship's downed drones had once been. Daniel didn't wait for her to process what had happened. "Move!" he barked, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. She stumbled but followed, her breathing ragged as the pain in her side deepened. The Marines watched as their captain led the alien commander away, their hesitation giving way to confused shouting. "Stand down!" Daniel commanded over his shoulder, his voice a knife cutting through the clamor. "She's coming with me!" "What? You can't be serious. She's the enemy," one of the soldiers protested, his rifle wavering as he stepped forward. "Not anymore," Daniel snapped, his tone brooking no argument. "We need her alive. She's the key to ending this pointless bloodbath." The soldier faltered, his weapon lowering slightly as doubt etched itself across his face. Meanwhile, Erin stumbled again, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. The human captain tightened his grip, glancing back over his shoulder. "You can't run on pride alone," Daniel muttered, his voice softer this time. "Lean on me if you have to." "Save your pity," she managed to growl, though her already weak glare lacked conviction. Still, she allowed herself to shift some of her weight onto him, her steps becoming just a bit steadier. Behind them, the storm intensified, rain beginning to lash the battlefield like needles. Overhead, the alien fleet loomed, their massive ships brimming with weapons that could reduce everything to ash in a heartbeat. And yet, for the first time in days, the glint of something, apart from despair, flickered in the gloom. A fragile spark of hope. For the briefest of moments, enemies had become something more. The minutes that followed were a blur. Daniel and Erin found themselves behind enemy lines, briefly shielded by the ruins of Ziari outposts battered into the dirt. The weight of each other's gaze felt heavier than their wounds. Despite the war raging on, something unspoken lingered between them, a shared exhaustion that only soldiers of opposing sides could understand. Why now? Why save me? Aaron asked, voice low and laced with suspicion. Daniel exhaled, a weariness in his voice he couldn't hide. Because this war will burn us all to ash if we don't stop it. We've killed too many, lost too much. You know we can't win. Neither can you. We fight for survival, Aaron whispered, with bitterness woven into her words. Would you surrender Earth if you thought it was the only chance to save humanity? Maybe not, Daniel admitted, but I'd try to find a third option. Foolish, and yet, she paused, studying his face, your kind excels in foolish hope. For the first time, a flicker of humor ghosted her lips. It was fleeting, but undeniable. Daniel laughed softly, shaking his head. I guess I'll take that as a compliment coming from you. What followed wasn't peace, but something close enough. Through stolen moments of dialogue amid the carcass of war, Daniel and Aaron did something unthinkable. They began to understand one another. They spoke not as enemies or soldiers, but as people worn down by the battles they never asked for, but had no choice but to fight. They shared more than battles, heartaches too. Aaron of comrades lost because pride stayed her hand. Daniel of the friends he buried while shouldering a duty that crushed his soul more than any plasma burns. They realized something vital that transcended their rivalry. They both wanted the war to end, but understanding alone wouldn't grant them peace. Their fragile truce could crumble at any second. Yet their chance came, not without danger, not without risk. Word of their tenuous alliance spread faster than light. Betrayal and treachery loomed on both sides. Some among Earth's ranks saw Daniel's actions as treason, accusing him of endangering humanity. Within Ziari forces, dissent exploded, leaders blindsided by their general's conversation with an enemy captain. Daniel and Aaron were left as pariahs, driven by a singular purpose to end the war, racing against dissent to outpace its inevitable hunting shadow. Together, the impossible happened. A temporary ceasefire was proposed, humans and Ziari agreeing to hold their weapons for one brief week. Daniel and Aaron's shared conviction swayed a few of their leaders, securing this fragile standstill. The cost was steep. Both were branded as traitors. Both stood at odds with the very comrades they'd once fought beside. Their hope, improbably, stubbornly, inspired others, creating fractures within die-hard hierarchies that had clung to war like a shield. But as factions rose to dismantle the truce, Daniel and Aaron stood resolute on Velos 7, their combined presence a symbol of rebellion against endless bloodshed. With a small force of allies from both sides, people tired of fighting, yearning for change, they confronted the dissenters. The battle was fierce, but their resolve became legend. Together, they broke the cycle of hatred that had perpetuated the war. Velos 7, once a battleground, would instead be the first step toward cooperation. The aftermath of the battle rippled across the universe like a galactic storm. News of the events on Velos 7 spread to every corner, igniting debates, discussions, and, most importantly, hope. For the first time in decades, humans and Ziari began to envision a future where survival did not hinge on the annihilation of the other. Daniel and Aaron, once condemned as villains by their own people, became reluctant symbols of unity. But the road ahead was far from easy. Trust, shattered by years of turmoil, would not be mended overnight. Skeptics remained on both sides, their voices loud and vehement, warning of treachery and questioning the intentions behind the fragile ceasefire. Still, Daniel and Aaron pressed on, meeting tirelessly with leaders, scientists, and civilians, weaving the fragile threads of peace into something stronger. Their work bore its first fruit on Velos 7 as they established the Unity Accord, an agreement born out of necessity, but alive with the promise of coexistence. It was written in both human and Ziari languages, signed beneath the echoing skies of the battlefield-turned-neutral ground. The first step toward a shared future had begun, even as the shadows of their past conflict lingered on the horizon. Together they would face those shadows, determined to prove that peace was worth the risk. The Ziari and Earth leaders, reluctant but moved by the pair's defiance, agreed to negotiate. Together, even as Daniel and Aaron faced exile from their respective worlds, they became the architects of peace. The formerly war-scorched sky began to clear, and new seeds of hope, fragile as a truce, took root. Yet as the seeds of hope began to sprout, the reality of coexistence unveiled a labyrinth of challenges. The Unity Accord, though a momentous achievement, was only the foundation of what would become a towering but fragile structure of reconciliation. On Earth, whispers of dissent grew into fervent protests. The scars left by the war were still fresh, and for many the idea of trusting the Ziari seemed as impossible as rewriting the stars. Similarly, on Ziari homeworlds, factions resisted the notion of alliance, clinging to centuries of mistrust as a shield against change. Daniel and Aaron knew they were forging a path through a storm. Where some saw conflict, they saw an opportunity to rebuild, not just cities, but hearts and minds. This meant embarking on an unprecedented diplomatic mission, traveling from system to system to speak with those overlooked by war councils and strategic summits, farmers tending scorched fields, engineers repairing shattered infrastructure, even children curious about what it meant to live without fear. All became part of a greater vision, and it was through these journeys that they encountered unexpected allies. A Ziari healer who volunteered to teach her advanced bioengineering to human doctors, a human artist who painted murals depicting unity in the ruins of old battlefields. These small acts, born of compassion and creativity, began to chip away at the towering walls of prejudice. Slowly but surely, the idea of peace transformed from an abstract notion into a tangible reality. It was a long road paved with uncertainty, but Daniel and Aaron carried with them an unyielding belief, a belief that even in the ashes of despair, life and hope could rise anew. The galaxy watched, waiting to see if their fragile dream would hold or shatter under the weight of the past. Sapphire and Steel wouldn't forget this chapter, nor would Velos 7, and for the first time, the stars fell quiet, listening to the pulse of something greater than war.